What if the most powerful man in New York, who had lost everything that mattered, discovered, on a freezing night at Times Square, that the fragile breath of a child could rewrite his entire destiny? If stories of redemption, healing, and unexpected family touch your heart, consider subscribing and staying with us until the very last chapter of this journey. Jonathan Hays sat behind the wheel of his black Mercedes S-Class, its heated leather seats doing little to ease the cold lodged deep in his chest. The neon lights of Times Square pulsed in the distance, bathing the night in electric reds and blues. But for him, the city had long since gone dim. At 42, he was the CEO of Hays Global, a man who once commanded boardrooms and headlines, but tonight he was only a hollow figure drifting through the streets of Manhattan. 3 years had passed since the accident. His wife, Amelia, and their 6-year-old daughter, Claire, had been driving home from a school recital when a truck barreled through an intersection. The impact had been merciless. By the time Jonathan reached the hospital, their hands were already cold. Since that night, Jonathan had lived like a ghost. He occupied a penthouse on the Upper West Side that still smelled faintly of Amelia's perfume, still displayed Claire's finger paintings taped unevenly on the fridge. He went to work, signed papers, fought battles on Wall Street, but his heart had been buried with them. On this night, the city was wrapped in bitter December winds. Snow fell thick and heavy, coating the streets in silence. Jonathan had left his office late, unable to stand the emptiness of his penthouse. He drove aimlessly through Manhattan, past the glittering marquees and crowded bars, searching for nothing. And then he saw it. Near a bus stop just off Times Square, beneath a flickering streetlight, 2 figures huddled together on the frozen bench. A young woman, perhaps mid-20s, wrapped her thin coat tighter around a small bundle. Snow had settled on her hair, turning it silver in the glow. The bundle shifted, and a tiny face peeked out. A girl no older than 2, cheeks flushed red with cold, lips trembling. Jonathan slowed his car, for reasons he couldn't name. He stopped. He rolled down the window, the winter air slapping his face like ice. The little girl stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, lashes crusted with snowflakes. Then, in a voice fragile as glass, she whispered, "Mommy?" Jonathan's breath caught. The sound pierced him, cutting straight to the marrow. It was Claire's voice he heard in that moment, echoing from memory. His hands clenched the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. The woman stirred awake, her eyes wide and alert, like someone who had learned to sleep with fear. She gathered the child closer and looked up at him. Jonathan saw exhaustion carved into her face, dark circles, pale skin, the kind of weariness that comes not just from sleepless nights, but from carrying too much alone. For a moment, neither spoke. The snow swirled around them, a cruel audience. Jonathan cleared his throat. "You shouldn't be out here." The woman blinked, protective instinct sharpening her expression. "We don't have anywhere else." Her voice was steady, though he could hear it trembling at the edges. Jonathan should have driven away. He told himself this wasn't his concern, that the streets of New York were filled with stories like this. But the child's whimper lingered in his ears. Something inside him cracked open, a fault line he had fought hard to seal. He parked the car, stepped out, and crossed the icy pavement. His tailored coat did nothing to shield him from the memory of Claire's tiny hand slipping out of his on the last morning they shared. He knelt slightly, eye level with the child. The girl's eyes were large, impossibly clear, reflecting the harsh neon glow of Times Square. She reached out with a trembling hand and brushed his sleeve, as if testing whether he was real. Jonathan swallowed hard. "What's her name?" The woman hesitated. "Sophie. Sophie." The name settled into him with strange warmth. He glanced at the woman again. "And you?" "Grace." she said softly. Her voice carried no plea, no practiced desperation, only truth. That truth held him fast. The child coughed. A thin, raspy sound that echoed too much like the nights Jonathan had sat by Claire's hospital bed with pneumonia. He felt the weight of the city pressing in, the indifference of wealth, the cruelty of winter, the unbearable silence of grief. Jonathan drew a long breath. "Get in the car." Grace stiffened. "Why?" "Because it's 20 degrees and dropping," he said, his tone sharper than he intended. He softened it quickly. "And because she won't make it through the night like this." Grace's lips parted as if to argue, but Sophie stirred again, clutching his sleeve with surprising force. The child's tiny fingers wouldn't let go. That was when Jonathan realized. He wasn't choosing. The choice had already been made for him. The moment he heard her whisper. He opened the back door of his Mercedes, brushing snow from the seat. Grace hesitated, eyes darting between him and the street. Then she gathered Sophie in her arms and slid inside. Jonathan returned to the driver's seat. For a moment, he just sat there, gripping the wheel, listening to the sound of Sophie's small breaths behind him. He felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in years, the fragile pulse of responsibility, the dangerous flicker of hope. As he pulled away from the curb, the neon lights of Times Square flashed in his rearview mirror like a warning. He didn't know it yet, but this single act of compassion would ignite a chain of revelations, betrayals, and choices that would test everything he thought he knew about loss and about love. For the first time in years, Jonathan Hays wasn't driving alone. The hum of the Mercedes filled the silence, a steady rhythm against the howl of winter outside. Snow slanted across the windshield, each flake striking like a fragment of glass. Inside, warmth slowly seeped from the vents, wrapping the car in a fragile cocoon. Jonathan Hays gripped the steering wheel, his gaze fixed on the road, but his mind was restless. Behind him, in the soft glow of the cabin lights, Grace sat with Sophie curled against her chest. The child's breaths were shallow but steady, her tiny fist still gripping a corner of Jonathan's coat sleeve that she had refused to release, even as he started the engine. He had tried to gently pull away before putting the car in gear, but Sophie's hold had been unyielding. Her little hand clung with a strength that startled him, a wordless demand that carried the weight of something more than a child's fear. It was as though she knew, instinctively, that letting go meant disappearing again into the cold. Jonathan swallowed hard, his chest tightening. He remembered the last time he'd felt a child's hand holding his sleeve. Claire, tugging him toward the carousel at Central Park, giggling as she begged for one more ride. That memory, once buried under layers of grief, rose now like a wound torn open. He cleared his throat. "How long have you been out there?" His voice was low, careful, as if he feared it might shatter the fragile peace. Grace shifted, adjusting Sophie's blanket. "Since yesterday morning," she said softly. Her eyes met his in the rearview mirror, guarded but honest. "We had nowhere else to go." Jonathan's brows knit. "No shelter? No family?" Grace shook her head. "We tried the shelters. They're full. And family—" She hesitated, her jaw tightening. "Family isn't an option." The words hung in the air like frost. Jonathan didn't press further, though questions gnawed at him. He had learned in both business and life that silence often revealed more than interrogation. The car glided past the dazzling billboards of Times Square, where crowds of tourists braved the cold for photos and laughter. Inside the Mercedes, another world existed, fragile, hushed, held together by the warmth of one small child's grip. Sophie stirred, lifting her head from Grace's shoulder. Her eyes, large and glassy, locked on to Jonathan through the gap between the seats. For a moment he felt pinned by that gaze, innocent yet knowing, as though she could see straight through the layers of armor he had built around himself. She hiccuped softly. "Don't leave," she whispered. Jonathan's hands tightened on the wheel. He hadn't realized until then that she wasn't just holding his sleeve, she was holding him. Her plea was not to the cold or the night, but to him, a stranger. And somehow in that instant, he no longer felt like one. Grace kissed her daughter's hair, murmuring, "It's all right, Sophie. We're safe for now." But her voice trembled, betraying a fear she couldn't hide. Jonathan glanced again in the mirror. He saw exhaustion etched into Grace's face, the sharp cheekbones, the hollowed eyes, the bruises half hidden beneath her sleeve. Questions rose again, darker this time. What had driven her here, to this bench in the heart of Manhattan, with nothing but a toddler and a cardboard sign? "You need a place to stay," Jonathan said, his tone more decisive than he expected. Grace tensed. "We don't want charity." "It's not charity." His voice hardened, not in anger but in conviction. "It's survival." The car turned north toward the Upper West Side. Grace's eyes widened slightly. "Where are you taking us?" "My place," he answered simply. Grace shook her head, alarm flashing across her face. "No, we can't." But before she could finish, Sophie's tiny voice interrupted. "Please, Mommy," she whispered, her fingers still locked on Jonathan's sleeve. "I don't want to be cold anymore." The words silenced them both. Grace closed her eyes, her breath shuddering. She had fought so hard to keep her dignity, to shield her daughter from pity, but Sophie's plea stripped every defense. Jonathan said nothing more. He let the city guide them, through Broadway's glitter, past Lincoln Center's icy fountains, up into the quiet streets where glass towers gave way to brownstones dusted in snow. At last, the car pulled up to a building whose entrance gleamed with marble and brass. The doorman hurried forward, surprised to see his employer return so late, and with company. Jonathan gave him a curt nod, leaving no room for questions. He escorted Grace and Sophie inside, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpets of the lobby. As the elevator rose, Grace clutched Sophie tighter, her eyes darting to Jonathan. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. The question carried suspicion, but beneath it lay confusion, even desperation. Jonathan met her gaze, his own weary and raw. "Because she wouldn't let go." The elevator doors opened, and they stepped into the penthouse. The vast space was immaculate, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, polished hardwoods, modern art on the walls. But the grandeur only emphasized its emptiness. Grace hesitated at the threshold, almost shrinking against the opulence. Sophie, however, wriggled down from her mother's arms, toddling toward the wide windows. She pressed her small hand to the glass, marveling at the snowy city below. Jonathan watched her, his heart tightening again. For years the penthouse had been nothing more than a mausoleum. Amelia's laughter gone, Claire's toys tucked away, silence thick in every corner town. But with Sophie's presence, something shifted. The silence cracked. Grace followed Sophie, kneeling beside her. Jonathan noticed then, in the brighter light, the faint purple marks on Grace's wrists, the pallor of her skin, the way she winced when she bent. He realized this was more than poverty. This was escape. He turned away, giving them space. He poured water from a crystal carafe, the act automatic, grounding him. When he offered a glass to Grace, she accepted with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice breaking just slightly. Jonathan nodded, but said nothing. He knew enough to understand that tonight was not the time for questions. Tonight was about heat, shelter, and a fragile thread of trust. Still, As he stood watching Grace cradle Sophie in his penthouse, Jonathan understood something with chilling clarity. His life, built on order and control, had just been rewritten by the grip of a child's hand. And deep down, though he would never admit it aloud, he didn't want her to let go. The elevator doors slid shut behind them with a hushed sigh, sealing Jonathan, Grace, and Sophie inside the cavernous penthouse. For a moment, none of them moved. The silence was immense, broken only by the faint hum of the city through double-paned glass. Jonathan switched on the lights. Warm amber glowed across the polished hardwood floors and white marble countertops, yet the space felt colder than the streets they had just left. The rooms stretched wide and immaculate, but their emptiness spoke louder than any mess could have. Grace stood frozen, clutching Sophie against her chest. Her eyes darted across the expansive living room, landing on the abstract paintings, the grand piano, the sleek leather furniture arranged with clinical precision. The scene carried no trace of life, no warmth, no clutter of a home. Only stillness, as though time had stopped the day Jonathan lost everything. Sophie wriggled free from her mother's arms, her tiny boots clattering softly against the floor. She toddled toward a low coffee table where a framed photograph stood, a rare imperfection in the curated emptiness. Grace reached out instinctively, but Jonathan shook his head gently, signaling it was all right. The photograph was of a smiling woman with chestnut hair, holding a little girl on her lap. The child's curls framed her round cheeks, her grin wide and free. They were Jonathan's Amelia and Claire. Sophie lifted the frame with both hands, her small fingers smudging the glass. She studied the image with solemn curiosity. Then, in a voice barely audible, she asked, "Is this your family?" Jonathan's chest constricted. "Yes," he whispered. The words scraped against his throat. Grace glanced at him, her expression softening. There was something in her eyes, not pity, but recognition, as though she too knew the weight of absence. Jonathan walked over, gently taking the photo from Sophie's hands. He returned it to its place, careful, almost reverent. "They're not here anymore." Sophie tilted her head. "Where did they go?" The question pierced him. He crouched to meet her gaze, his own eyes stinging. "They went to a place where there's no more pain. Somewhere I can't follow. Not yet." Sophie nodded, as if this answer was enough. She pressed her palm against his sleeve again, the same unyielding gesture from before. Jonathan almost broke under it. Grace shifted uneasily. She touched the bruise on her wrist, then quickly lowered her hand when she realized he noticed. Jonathan's gaze lingered, his mind already piecing together what she was hiding. "You're hurt," he said quietly. Grace shook her head. "It's nothing." But the faint tremor in her voice betrayed her. Jonathan straightened, crossing to the kitchen. He returned with a first aid kit, setting it on the table. His movements were precise, almost clinical, as though tending to wounds was something he'd done many times before. "Sit," he said, his tone carrying the quiet authority of someone who had led boardrooms, yet now channeled it into something gentler. Grace hesitated but obeyed. She lowered herself onto the couch, Sophie curled beside her. Jonathan sat across from them, opening the kit. His hands moved with practiced steadiness as he disinfected a cotton pad and reached for her wrist. Grace flinched at his touch. "I'm not going to hurt you," Jonathan murmured. "Oh." Their eyes met. For a heartbeat, the penthouse no longer felt like marble and glass, but like a room filled with ghosts. His, hers, all the invisible scars that neither could deny. "Who did this to you?" he asked softly. Grace pulled her wrist back. "It doesn't matter." "It matters," Jonathan countered. Because whoever put you on that bench in the snow might try again." Her lips parted as if to argue, but her voice broke instead. She looked away, tears glistening in her lashes. Sophie patted her mother's arm with innocent comfort. Jonathan didn't press further. He wrapped the bandage carefully, then closed the kit. His mind, however, raced. He had seen enough in boardroom betrayals to know the look of someone hunted, cornered. Grace's silence wasn't avoidance. It was protection. Later, as Grace settled Sophie into the guest room, once Claire's playroom, still faint with pastel paint and a dollhouse untouched for years, Jonathan stood in the hallway, leaning against the wall. He listened to Sophie's quiet giggles as Grace tucked her in with blankets far too fine for their worn clothes. For the first time since Amelia and Claire's deaths, the penthouse carried the sound of a child's laughter again. It broke him, and it healed him, both at once. When Grace emerged, she found Jonathan staring at the city through the window wall, his silhouette framed against the storm outside. She approached cautiously, folding her arms. "You don't have to do this," she said. "You don't even know us." Jonathan didn't turn. "I know enough." "Enough for what?" He exhaled, fogging the glass. "Enough to see that you didn't end up on that bench by accident. And enough to know that if I'd kept driving tonight, I would have buried what little was left of me alongside the ghosts already here." Grace swallowed hard, her composure faltering. "We'll leave in the morning," she whispered. Jonathan finally looked at her. His eyes, shadowed by grief yet burning with something fierce, met hers. "You're not going anywhere until I know you're safe." The words landed heavy, final. Grace wanted to protest, but her body sagged under exhaustion. She nodded once, silently. Jonathan returned his gaze to the window, the city lights reflected in his eyes. For years he had lived with ghosts, Amelia's perfume lingering in the halls, Claire's laughter echoing in memory. But tonight, with Grace and Sophie beneath his roof, he realized the ghosts had company. And perhaps for the first time, they weren't just reminders of what he lost, but warnings of what he might still save. Snow kept falling, blanketing Manhattan in silence, but inside the penthouse, silence carried another weight. Grace sat at the dining table in one of Jonathan's oversized sweaters he had insisted she wear, her damp coat folded neatly over the chair. Sophie was curled on the sofa nearby, fast asleep under a thick wool throw, her breaths rising and falling with the innocence of exhaustion. Jonathan moved around the kitchen, his motions precise as he prepared something simple: soup, bread, tea. It felt strange, almost foreign, to occupy this space for more than coffee and late-night scotch. His home had been a mausoleum for so long. Tonight it smelled of food and warmth. He set a steaming bowl in front of Grace. "Eat," he said gently. She hesitated. "You don't have to—" "Grace," he interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. "You haven't eaten. Neither has she. Don't argue." Her shoulders relaxed, surrendering. She picked up the spoon, blowing gently on the broth before tasting. The warmth spread across her face, and Jonathan noticed the faint tremble in her hands. For a long while, neither spoke. The only sounds were the faint hum of the heating system and the storm beating against the glass walls. But Jonathan's eyes never left Grace. He wanted answers. He wanted to understand why a woman who spoke with the quiet intelligence of someone educated, someone disciplined, was sitting in his home with a child and bruises she refused to explain. Finally, she set the spoon down and whispered, "I was a nurse." Jonathan tilted his head, surprised by her openness. "Where?" "Mount Sinai Hospital. Pediatrics." Her gaze dropped to her lap, as though ashamed of what she had once been. Jonathan's mind filled with the sterile hallways he knew well. He had donated millions to hospitals after losing his daughter. "Why aren't you there now?" Her throat tightened. She clasped her hands together, her knuckles pale. Because I made a mistake. Jonathan frowned. What kind of mistake? Grace's voice steadied, though it trembled at the edges. I spoke the truth. The words hung between them like a strike of thunder. She looked at him then, eyes sharp, no longer tired but burning. They were running trials with a new pediatric drug. Experimental. Children were getting sick, sicker than before. I filed reports, I raised alarms, I thought... She shook her head. I thought doing the right thing would protect them. Instead, it destroyed me. Jonathan leaned back slowly, his jaw tightening. What happened? They silenced me, she said. The administration forced me out. Then the lawsuits came. Not against the hospital, against me. They said I falsified records, that I endangered patients. No one wanted to hire me after that. Sophie and I lost everything. Jonathan's pulse quickened. The pieces slid into place like jagged glass. Which company was behind the drug? He asked. Grace hesitated. Her lips pressed tight, as though afraid to say the name aloud. Pharmadyne, she whispered finally. Jonathan froze. He knew the name all too well. Pharmadyne was more than a rival. It was the corporation that had circled like a vulture over his own company for years, waiting for weakness. And in the quiet of his soul, he remembered the investigation that had followed his wife and daughter's accident. The truck driver who hit them had been employed by a Pharmadyne contractor. The police had called it negligence. Jonathan had buried his suspicion, convincing himself it was random tragedy. Now, listening to Grace, he felt the old wound tear open. What if it hadn't been an accident at all? Grace's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. We've been hiding ever since, moving from place to place. I thought maybe if I stayed quiet long enough, they'd forget me. But then Sophie... She glanced at her daughter, asleep on the couch. I couldn't stay quiet anymore. She deserves better. Jonathan stood, pacing toward the window. Snow lashed against the glass, a storm mirroring the one rising in his chest. His reflection glared back at him. A man who had once believed wealth made him untouchable, only to discover that corruption was stronger than grief. He turned back to her. Grace, you're not safe. If Pharmadyne went to those lengths to silence you, they won't stop. Not until... Her voice cut him off, calm but cold. Not until I'm gone. Jonathan stared at her, his hands curling into fists. He remembered Claire's voice, her laughter, her fragile body in a hospital bed. He had been powerless then, but now, with Grace and Sophie before him, he refused to be powerless again. You're not alone anymore, he said, his voice low but unshakable. Grace blinked, startled by the conviction in his tone. I've fought men like them in boardrooms, Jonathan continued. I've seen how deep their pockets run, how far they'll go to bury truth. But I'm still here. And if they've hurt you, if they had anything to do with what happened to Amelia and Claire... His voice cracked, but his eyes burned. Then they've made this war personal. Grace stared at him, her lips parting in disbelief. Why would you risk yourself for us? Jonathan stepped closer, his voice softening. Because Sophie wouldn't let go. And because the night I stopped that car, I realized I couldn't lose another child to the snow. Tears welled in Grace's eyes, but she turned her face away, unwilling to let them fall. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, a fragile alliance was born. 2 lives broken by the same shadow, now bound by something stronger than chance. Neither of them knew it yet, but the ghosts in Jonathan's penthouse had just been joined by a living enemy, one that would not rest until both Grace's truth and Jonathan's past were silenced forever. The following morning, Manhattan awoke beneath a sky of dull pewter. The storm had passed, leaving the city streets crusted in ice and muffled under gray snowbanks. Yet inside the gleaming glass tower of Hayes Global on Park Avenue, the storm was just beginning. Jonathan Hayes entered through the private lobby, his polished shoes striking the marble floor with steady authority. He was dressed in a sharp navy suit, tie knotted with precision, yet the set of his jaw betrayed a simmering unrest. His thoughts lingered not on the agenda that awaited him, but on the fragile figure of Grace Miller and the child who had clutched his sleeve as though her life depended on it. He had left them in the penthouse, guarded by a trusted staff member who had once served Amelia. For the first time in years, his home no longer felt like a tomb. But even as warmth crept into his personal life, a cold war awaited in the boardroom. The board of Hayes Global had been restless for months. Jonathan's grief had left gaps in leadership, and rivals had circled like sharks. Most pressing was the looming presence of Pharmadyne, the pharmaceutical giant whose tendrils stretched through politics and Wall Street alike. They had made overtures before, offers disguised as partnerships. Jonathan had always refused. Now, rumors whispered of a full takeover attempt. The elevator opened onto the 52nd floor. Jonathan adjusted his cufflinks and strode into the boardroom. It was a temple of power, floor-to-ceiling windows flooding the room with cold winter light, a polished mahogany table stretching the length of the chamber, and portraits of past CEOs glaring down from the walls like silent judges. Around the table sat 12 directors, men and women of wealth and pedigree, their expressions carefully schooled. At the head of the table, Jonathan took his seat. "Good morning," he said evenly. His voice carried the quiet authority that once made investors hang on his every word. "Let's begin." The CFO, a lean man named Richard Stanton, cleared his throat. "Mr. Hayes, the first item is the Pharmadyne proposal. Their board has made a formal offer for acquisition, 20% above market value." A murmur rippled through the directors. Numbers like that commanded attention. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Hayes Global is not for sale. Another director, a woman with a pearl necklace that gleamed under the lights, leaned forward. "Jonathan, with respect, our stock has underperformed since last quarter. An offer like this could secure generational wealth for shareholders. It deserves serious consideration." Jonathan's eyes hardened. "Pharmadyne doesn't want a partnership. They want a cover. They want our reputation, our infrastructure, our name, and they will use it to bury what they don't want the public to see." A low silence settled over the room. Jonathan let it stretch before he spoke again. "I have evidence," he said. His voice dropped, steel beneath velvet. "Their trials are unsafe. They're silencing whistleblowers. Children are being hurt." Gasps erupted. One director scoffed openly. "That's a dangerous accusation." Jonathan's gaze swept the table. He thought of Grace's trembling hands, of the bruises she carried like hidden scars. He thought of Sophie whispering, "Don't leave." His grief had once left him paralyzed. Now it burned like fuel. "Dangerous, yes," he said, "but true." From the far end of the table, a voice rang out smooth and deliberate. "Jonathan, perhaps you should consider whether your personal tragedies are coloring your judgment." It was Charles Whitmore, senior board member, an old ally of his father's generation. Charles had the calm of a seasoned predator, silver hair combed neatly back, eyes sharp as glass. He had sat at Jonathan's table for years, always advising caution, always counseling compromise. Jonathan leaned forward, his tone sharpened. "Explain yourself." Charles folded his hands. "You've suffered greatly. We all sympathize. But grief can make a man see shadows where none exist. Pharmadyne is offering salvation for this company. Yet here you are, spinning tales of corruption without proof. Jonathan's heart pounded. He saw it now, too clearly. The ease with which Charles defended them, the subtle digs at his credibility. This wasn't skepticism. It was allegiance. "You're working with them," Jonathan said, the words striking like a gavel. The room froze. Directors exchanged nervous glances. Charles's lips curled faintly, neither confirming nor denying. Richard Stanton interjected quickly. "Mr. Hayes, perhaps we should table this matter until you have verifiable documentation." Jonathan stood, his chair scraping against the floor. His presence filled the room, shadows stretching long in the morning light. "Verifiable documentation?" His voice thundered. "I buried my wife and child because of a so-called accident tied to a Pharmadyne contractor. I took in a woman and her daughter last night who were driven onto the street because she tried to expose their crimes. Don't speak to me of documentation when I've seen their destruction with my own eyes." The directors shifted uneasily. For the first time in months, Jonathan's grief had hardened into something unbreakable. Charles rose slowly, adjusting his cufflinks. "Then you leave us no choice. If you cannot act in the best interests of Hayes Global, we may be forced to reconsider your position as CEO." The words struck like ice water. A coup laid bare. Jonathan met his gaze unflinching. "Do it then. But know this, if Pharmadyne thinks they can silence me, they've chosen the wrong man. I will burn down their empire brick by brick before I let them take another child's life." The boardroom vibrated with the weight of his vow. Jonathan gathered his papers, his movements crisp, and strode out without waiting for adjournment. Behind him, voices erupted in chaos, directors arguing, alliances shifting. But he no longer cared. In the elevator's mirrored walls, Jonathan saw his reflection. Not the hollow ghost of a widower, but a man forged anew by fury and resolve. For the first time in years, he had purpose. Grace's truth had become his war. As the elevator descended, he pulled out his phone. One name lit up on the screen, an investigative attorney he hadn't called in years. His thumb hovered, then pressed dial. "Jonathan Hayes," came the clipped greeting on the other end. "I need to bring down Pharmadyne," Jonathan said. His voice was calm, steady as the storm outside broke into light. "And I have witnesses." When the elevator doors opened onto the street, Jonathan stepped into the cold air of Manhattan, his breath visible in the winter morning. Above him, the skyscrapers glistened like ice. The battle had begun. Night pressed heavily over Manhattan, the kind that muffled even the honking horns and left the avenues hushed under a thick coat of snow. From his car window, Jonathan Hayes watched the city slide by in streaks of light and shadow, but his mind lingered only on Grace and Sophie back in the penthouse. He had promised them safety, but the boardroom that morning had reminded him just how many knives were pointed at his back. When the elevator opened onto the private floor of his apartment, the silence felt sharper than usual. He entered, loosened his tie, and set his briefcase down with mechanical precision. The penthouse was dark except for the faint glow from the skyline spilling through floor-to-ceiling windows. He moved through the rooms on instinct, checking each one without admitting to himself why. Old habits from years in corporate war zones, and new instincts from sheltering two souls who had become fragile pieces of his heart. Only when he was satisfied the penthouse was empty did he pour himself a glass of water and head for the hallway leading to his bedroom. That was when he saw it. A white envelope slid halfway under the front door. Jonathan froze. His staff never left mail this way. Deliveries went through security downstairs. Slowly he crouched, lifting the envelope. His name was written across the front in hurried strokes, J. Hayes. The paper was slightly damp from melted snow, as though dropped minutes ago. His first thought was a threat, but the weight of the envelope suggested otherwise. He carried it to the kitchen table, the lights casting stark clarity across the marble surface. He broke the seal and unfolded the contents. Photocopies, dozens of them. Pages of internal trial reports stamped Pharmadyne Pediatric Trial 07A. Numbers, charts, mortality rates quietly marked in the margins. Elevated deaths. Adverse events mislabeled as resolved. Jonathan's jaw tightened. It was exactly the kind of proof Grace had described. The kind that could bury a company or bury the person holding it. At the back was a short memo, typed and unsigned. All irregularities to be contained. Legal exposure unacceptable. Neutralize whistleblowers immediately. C.W. Jonathan's stomach dropped. C.W. Charles Whitmore. He gripped the papers until the edges cut into his hands. His suspicion from the boardroom was no longer suspicion. It was fact. Whitmore wasn't just a cautious board member. He was Pharmadyne's man inside Hayes Global. A faint vibration rattled his phone against the table. One new message from an unknown number. I couldn't stay silent. Check trial 07A. They buried the kids. They're watching me. Don't respond. Jonathan immediately pulled up the security feed on his phone. The hallway camera caught only a blur, a figure in scrubs, hood pulled low, moving with quick steps toward the service elevator. A hospital ID badge glinted backward against the chest. 30 seconds later, the figure vanished. A whistleblower. Someone still inside, risking everything. And they had chosen him. Jonathan's pulse hammered. For years he had buried suspicion about Amelia and Claire's accident. Now the pieces began to align with terrifying clarity. Behind him, a soft voice broke the silence. Jonathan? He turned. Grace stood in the doorway, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her hair tousled from restless sleep. Her eyes drifted to the papers on the table. What's that? He hesitated. Part of him wanted to shield her from it. But Grace had lived the nightmare firsthand. This was her truth as much as his. He gestured her closer. Grace crossed the room, clutching the blanket tighter. When she saw the header on the reports, her breath caught. These are the trial files. She reached for one, her fingers trembling. She scanned the lines, her eyes widening with each page. They match everything I reported, the dosage spikes, the hospitalizations. They called me a liar for this. Jonathan slid the memo across to her. Read the signature. Her gaze fell on the initials. For a heartbeat she seemed not to understand. Then realization struck, her face blanching. C.W. Whitmore. He's on your board. Jonathan nodded grimly. He's more than that. He's Pharmadyne's inside man, and he knows who you are. Grace staggered back, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. If he knows where I am... Jonathan rose, his voice firm. Then this is the safest place you can be. They won't touch you here. Even as he said it, doubt gnawed at him. The envelope had found its way past building security. Whoever delivered it had managed to walk right up to his door. Grace hugged herself, her voice shaking. They've already taken everything from me. If they take Sophie... Jonathan stepped forward, his hand steady on her arm. They won't. Not again. His eyes burned, the memory of his daughter's last morning a brand on his soul. I lost my child once. I will not lose another. Her gaze met his, fragile but fierce. Then we use this. We don't run anymore. Jonathan studied her. Exhausted, bruised, terrified, and yet she stood straighter than he had ever seen. She wasn't asking him to save her. She was demanding the chance to fight back. He nodded slowly. Tomorrow I'll meet with Mercer. We'll move quietly. No one on the board can know until we're ready." Grace exhaled, relief and fear warring across her face. She brushed her hands over the documents once more, as if grounding herself in their reality. "These children," she whispered, "they were real. They had names. They deserve justice." Jonathan closed the folder with deliberate care and locked it in his safe. "And they'll have it, along with Amelia, along with Claire." For a moment, silence pressed around them, heavy with the weight of promises. Grace's eyes shimmered, unshed tears reflecting the city lights beyond the glass. She whispered, "Jonathan, I believe you." He had heard those words before, from investors, from board members, from allies who later betrayed him. But tonight, from her, they landed differently. They weren't about profit or power. They were about truth. The storm outside thickened, snow swirling like ash across the skyline. Inside the penthouse, amid fear and fragile trust, a war was declared. Not with weapons, but with documents, voices, and the determination of two people who had already lost too much. And as Jonathan turned off the lights and checked the locks once more, he knew with cold certainty Whitmore and Farmadine had made their mistake. They thought they could silence Grace Miller. They thought they could bury Amelia and Claire with the wreckage of a staged accident. But the envelope under the door had changed everything. The shadows had delivered him proof, and Jonathan Hayes would not rest until he dragged them into the light. The weekend dawned deceptively calm, the sky brittle blue after a night of snowfall. Branches in Central Park bent beneath white weight, the air crisp and sharp. Children darted across the fields, bundled in bright scarves, sleds scraping over the powder. Laughter rose in clouds of mist, proof that even in winter the city's heart beat strong. Jonathan had resisted when Grace suggested a walk. He still saw shadows in every corner, still distrusted the quiet between storms. But Sophie's pleading eyes had dissolved his resolve. She had pressed her mittened hands together and whispered, "Please, Daddy, I want to play in the snow." He had given in. How could he not? Bundled in her red coat and knit hat, Sophie seemed more like a flame than a child. Bright, flickering, fragile. Grace held her hand as they stepped onto the path, her face flushed from the cold, but softened by Sophie's joy. Jonathan walked beside them, his hands buried in his coat pockets, scanning every passerby with an instinct he could not switch off. For a blissful half-hour, the world felt almost normal. Sophie tumbled into snowbanks, shrieked with delight as Grace taught her how to roll snowballs, and clapped her mittens when Jonathan hoisted her high to place a stick nose on a crooked snowman. For Jonathan, the sound of her laughter was both balm and blade. It healed and it cut, reminding him of another little girl whose laughter once filled his days. But then, the shadows moved. Jonathan noticed a man in a dark parka lingering near the path, head down as though fumbling with his boot. He tied and retied the laces but kept glancing their way. Across the field, a woman in a knit cap walked too slowly, her eyes flicking back too often. Jonathan's instincts sharpened. Years of hostile takeovers and corporate espionage had trained him to read danger in body language. These two didn't belong. "Grace," he murmured, his voice low but urgent. "Stay close to Sophie." She caught his tone instantly, her own body tensing. "What is it?" But before he could answer, Sophie giggled and darted toward a slide dusted with snow. "Mommy! Daddy! Watch me!" Jonathan's heart lurched. "Sophie, wait!" It happened in seconds. The woman in the knit cap swooped in, scooping Sophie into her arms. Sophie screamed, thrashing in panic. Grace's cry split the air. "No!" Grace sprinted forward, clawing at the woman. She's just a child! Jonathan charged, but the man in the parka lunged into his path. They collided hard, boots skidding on ice. Jonathan's fist drove into the man's jaw, splitting his knuckles. Pain seared, but he didn't stop. He slammed the man back into a snowbank, breaking free with a roar. Grace clawed at the woman, yanking Sophie's arm. "Give her back!" she cried, desperation shredding her voice. The woman hissed, her breath fogging in the air. "You should have stayed quiet, Grace." The words froze Grace's blood. This wasn't random. This was a message. A black SUV screeched to the curb. The woman shoved Sophie inside. Tires spun against the ice, spraying slush as the vehicle lurched forward. Jonathan sprinted, every muscle screaming, his lungs burning. "Sophie!" His voice cracked through the winter air, raw and thunderous. He pounded after the SUV, but his shoes slipped on the ice, slowing him. The vehicle fishtailed, then accelerated, vanishing around a bend. Silence crashed down, deafening after the chaos. Grace collapsed to her knees in the snow, her hands pressed to her mouth. "They took her. Oh God, Jonathan, they took her." Jonathan stood trembling, his chest heaving, blood dripping from his torn knuckles. He had failed once before, Amelia, Claire, and the universe had ripped another child from his arms. The wound was unbearable, a second death. But then, something fierce ignited. He would not surrender, not again. He knelt beside Grace, gripping her shoulders with iron steadiness. "Listen to me. They want to silence you. Sophie is leverage. As long as she's leverage, she's alive." Grace's tear-streaked face lifted, her eyes wide with terror. But his conviction steadied her. "What do we do?" Jonathan pulled out his phone with shaking hands. "We find them. I'll use everything I have. Money, power, people. We will bring her back." He barked orders into the phone, his security chief, his attorney, his contacts in the NYPD who still owed him favors. He demanded every traffic camera on the east side pulled, every black SUV traced, every warehouse scouted. For 2 days they lived in hell. Grace barely ate, barely slept, pacing the penthouse like a caged animal. Jonathan worked phones until his voice went hoarse, coordinating searches, wiring funds, making threats. The air itself seemed to vibrate with their desperation. Then, on the second night, headlights flared outside the building. A black sedan pulled up, silent as a predator. The doorman froze, unsure. Before he could act, the rear door opened and Sophie stumbled out, clutching something to her chest. The driver sped off, disappearing into the night. Grace screamed her daughter's name and flew to her, sweeping her into her arms. Sophie sobbed, her small body shaking violently. Jonathan wrapped them both in his arms, his throat raw with relief. But then he saw what Sophie carried. A cheap plastic doll, stitched smile faded, gripped tightly in her tiny hands. Grace pried gently at the seam and froze. Inside was a small memory card wrapped in tape. Jonathan took it, slid it into his laptop, and opened the single file. A distorted voice filled the room. "We know where you live. We can take her any time. Next time she doesn't come back. Testimony ends, or the line ends." Grace's face went white, her arms crushing Sophie to her chest. Jonathan's jaw locked, fury burning through every vein. This was no longer intimidation. This was war. He shut the laptop, the room thick with silence except for Sophie's sobs. He knelt, cupping her tear-streaked face. "You're safe now," he whispered fiercely. "Daddy's here. I won't let them hurt you again." Sophie clung to his sleeve, her little voice hoarse. "Don't leave me, Daddy." His chest broke, but his resolve hardened into steel. "Never. Not ever." Grace pressed her forehead to his shoulder, her tears hot against his neck. "Jonathan, they'll kill us if we go through with this." He held them both, his arms a shield. Then we don't hide anymore. We fight. We take this to court. We burn them down in the light. For years, Jonathan Hays had been a man defined by loss. But as he looked into Sophie's terrified eyes, as he felt Grace trembling in his arms, he knew his identity had changed. He was no longer the widower haunted by ghosts. He was a father again, and fathers didn't surrender. The winter morning was razor-sharp, the kind that seemed to slice through coats and scarves, leaving even the heart shivering. Outside the U.S. District Courthouse on Pearl Street, crowds had gathered, their breath steaming in the frigid air. Some carried signs scrawled with slogans in bold red ink, "Protect our children, justice for the innocent." News vans lined the curb, satellite dishes glinting in the pale light. Inside a black SUV parked at the curb, Jonathan Hays stared at the courthouse steps. His jaw was set, his eyes dark. Beside him, Grace clutched Sophie's mittened hand, her own trembling hidden beneath the folds of her coat. Sophie, bundled in a scarlet coat and woolen hat, pressed her face to the window, her small breath fogging the glass. Daniel Mercer, their attorney, cleared his throat. "Remember, this isn't the full trial. Today is an emergency evidentiary hearing. The judge will decide whether your evidence is strong enough to move forward with federal prosecution." Jonathan nodded. "And if she rules against us? Then Pharmadyne buries everything. The documents, your testimony, Grace's voice, all gone." Mercer's gaze hardened. "But if she rules for us, the doors stay open. The shadows won't hold forever." Grace closed her eyes briefly, as though whispering a prayer. Jonathan reached across, covering her hand with his. The gesture was simple, but it carried the weight of shared battles and unspoken vows. When they stepped from the car, the crowd surged, cameras flashing, voices shouting questions like arrows. "Mr. Hays, is it true Pharmadyne funded the driver who killed your family? Miss Miller, were you dismissed for falsifying records?" Jonathan shielded Grace and Sophie with his body, guiding them up the courthouse steps. He didn't answer. Not yet. The time for silence was almost over. The courtroom itself was a cavern of marble and wood, the American flag draped behind the elevated bench. At its center sat Judge Eleanor Briggs, a woman whose reputation was carved in granite, sharp, unflinching, incorruptible. Her silver hair was pulled into a tight bun, her gavel resting like a promise of order. To her left, the government's table. To her right, Pharmadyne's army. Rows of sleek-suited attorneys, their briefcases lined like shields. At their center sat Victor Lang, Pharmadyne's CEO, exuding smug control, and next to him, shockingly unashamed, was Charles Whitmore, Jonathan's board member, his betrayer. Jonathan's fists tightened, but he forced himself into his seat beside Mercer. Grace sat behind them, Sophie on her lap, her small fingers twisting the hem of her mother's scarf. "All rise," the bailiff intoned. The room stood as Judge Briggs entered. She took her seat and scanned the courtroom with eyes that seemed to see straight through pretenses. "This hearing," she began, her voice carrying the weight of authority, "is convened to determine whether sufficient grounds exist to bring Pharmadyne Corporation to trial for allegations of corruption, fraudulent medical reporting, and endangerment of minors. Counsel for the government proceed." Mercer rose. Tall and commanding, he adjusted his glasses and spoke with measured clarity. "Your Honor, the evidence we present today is urgent. Children's lives have already been lost in these trials. Cover-ups have been orchestrated at the highest levels. If this evidence is not preserved in the light of federal scrutiny, it will vanish, along with any hope of justice." He stepped to the evidence table and lifted the folder Jonathan had locked in his safe. Here are the internal trial reports from Pharmadyne Pediatric Trial 07A, obtained from a whistleblower within the hospital system. These documents show elevated mortality rates, adverse events hidden from regulators, and explicit instructions to suppress the truth. He turned a page, holding it up. And here, Your Honor, is a memo signed by C.W. Charles Whitmore, a sitting member of Hayes Global's board, ordering whistleblowers to be neutralized. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously. Whitmore shifted in his chair but kept his face impassive, lips curved in the faintest sneer. The judge gestured. Defense, your response. Clarissa Vale, Pharmadyne's lead counsel, stood with the calm of someone who had built her career demolishing accusations. Your Honor, this so-called evidence is flimsy at best. Anonymous sources, unverifiable documents, and a grieving CEO who stands to benefit from tarnishing a competitor. This is not justice. This is theater. Her words dripped disdain as she turned toward Jonathan. Mr. Hayes has allowed his personal tragedies to color his judgment. To permit this to move forward would be to weaponize grief against progress in medical research. Jonathan's blood boiled, but Mercer's steady hand on his arm kept him silent. Your Honor, Mercer said smoothly, with your permission, I'd like to call our first witness, Grace Miller. Grace rose slowly, her knees trembling, but her back straight. She swore her oath and took her seat. Sophie's eyes followed her mother, wide and trusting. Mercer's tone softened. Ms. Miller, can you tell the court what you witnessed while working at Mount Sinai? Grace's voice wavered at first, but soon steadied. I was a pediatric nurse. I saw children sicker after the trial drugs than before. I filed reports. I begged supervisors to intervene. Instead, they silenced me. They said I was lying. They destroyed my reputation, blacklisted me. But I kept copies. She lifted her hand, trembling but firm. These papers aren't lies. They are the truth. And those children deserve to be heard. Clarissa Vale pounced for cross-examination. Ms. Miller, isn't it true you were dismissed for incompetence, that you fabricated results to hide your mistakes? Grace's chin lifted, her eyes flashing. If I were incompetent, why did Pharmadyne work so hard to silence me? Why threaten my child? Why put me on the streets rather than face the truth? The gallery erupted. Judge Briggs banged her gavel for order, but her expression softened just slightly as she looked at Grace. Thank you, Ms. Miller. You may step down. Mercer's voice rang again. Your Honor, our next witness, Jonathan Hayes. Jonathan rose, towering, his grief worn openly, but his resolve like iron. After swearing in, he faced the jury box. 3 years ago, my wife and daughter died in what was called an accident. A truck driver, hired by a Pharmadyne contractor, ran a red light. He disappeared days later. No one investigated. I buried them, believing it was random. But these documents, he gestured to the folder, show otherwise. They show a company willing to bury truth, silence voices, even orchestrate death to protect profits. His voice cracked, but he steadied it, locking eyes with the jurors. I will not let them silence Grace. I will not let them harm Sophie. And I will not let them erase the truth of what happened to my family. Not again. Not ever. The silence in the courtroom was electric, heavy with the weight of his vow. Clarissa Vale stood, flustered for the first time. Your Honor, these are emotional outbursts, not admissible facts. Judge Briggs raised a hand. Enough. The documents corroborate both witnesses. The allegations are grave. This hearing was called to decide whether these claims warrant trial. I have heard enough. She lifted her gavel. Pharmadyne will face federal prosecution. This matter proceeds to full trial. The room erupted, protesters cheering outside, reporters shouting questions. defense attorneys scrambling with papers. Grace pressed her hands to her mouth, tears spilling. Jonathan exhaled, his shoulders sagging with a mixture of relief and fury. For the first time, the shadows had cracked. The storm arrived without warning. By late afternoon, clouds rolled off the Hudson like bruised steel, and by dusk, snow was slamming against Manhattan's glass towers with a violence that rattled window frames. Jonathan Hayes stood at the wide windows of his penthouse, staring at the blizzard's white fury. Inside, the rooms were warm, but the air carried the same charged heaviness as the courtroom hours earlier. The emergency evidentiary hearing had cracked open Farmadine's armor. Judge Briggs had ruled in their favor, pushing the case forward. For the first time, Jonathan felt the shadows retreat. But he also knew the enemy was cornered, and cornered predators were dangerous. Behind him, Grace sat curled on the sofa, a mug of tea cradled in her hands. Sophie had finally fallen asleep upstairs, though her restless whimpers had pierced the quiet for hours. Grace's eyes flickered toward Jonathan. "You've been pacing since we got back. What's wrong?" Jonathan turned, his face lined with exhaustion. He hesitated. There were truths he had carried alone for too long, but tonight the storm outside seemed to demand that secrets be spoken. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice low. Grace set down her mug. "Jonathan, what is it?" He walked to the mantel, his hand brushing across the folder Mercer had pressed into his palm before they parted ways at the courthouse. His voice wavered, but he forced the words out. 3 years ago, when Amelia and Claire died, I told myself it was random. A truck ran a red light, an accident. But Mercer got a break yesterday. A man came forward, a systems contractor. He was on Farmadine's IT payroll, cleaning up servers tied to Whitmore. Jonathan's jaw tightened. They told him to wipe certain files. He couldn't do it. He copied them instead. Grace's eyes widened. He gave them to Mercer? Jonathan nodded. Yes, a flash drive, encrypted logs, internal emails, scheduling notes, everything. His voice broke. And in those files, they detailed my family's movements, my calendar, Amelia's travel patterns. They knew when Claire's recital ended. They planned the crash, Grace. It wasn't an accident. The words hung heavy in the room, louder than the storm battering the glass. Grace pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes filling. Jonathan? He shook his head, grief pouring out in ragged fragments. I thought my punishment was grief, that I deserved it for not being there, for not protecting them. But it wasn't fate. It was murder. And I've been living like a ghost while they sat in their boardrooms plotting their next profit. His body shook as the dam he had built for years finally cracked. Grace rose, crossing to him, her hand steady on his arm. You didn't fail them, she whispered. The failure belongs to Farmadine, to Whitmore, not to you. Jonathan turned, his eyes raw. And if I fail you? If Sophie... His voice caught, unable to finish. Grace cupped his face with both hands, her thumbs brushing tears from his cheeks. You won't fail? You're fighting now, Jonathan, and you're not fighting alone. For a moment he closed his eyes, breathing in her steadiness. Then she hesitated, her own secret pressing at the edge of her lips. There's something I need to tell you too, Grace said softly. Jonathan searched her face. What is it? Her voice trembled, but she forced it steady. Sophie doesn't have a father. Not really. The man I was with before, when I told him I was pregnant, he left. He wanted nothing to do with her. I've been both mother and father ever since. She's never called anyone Dad. Jonathan's chest ached with a pain both searing and tender. Sophie's little hand clinging to his sleeve, her whispered plea of "don't leave," it all came rushing back with brutal clarity. Grace's eyes shimmered. But when she looks at you, it's different. She trusts you. She clings to you as if she's found what she's been missing. If you want, if you can, you could be that for her. You could be the father she's never had. Jonathan's body shook. He saw Amelia's laughter, Claire's tiny arms wrapping around his neck, the silence after they were gone. And then he saw Sophie, fragile yet unbreakable, filling the hollow space in his heart with light he thought extinguished forever. Tears blurred his vision. He pulled Grace into his arms, holding her with a desperation that was almost feral. His voice broke into the storm. "I'll be her father. From this day forward, I'll be her father." Grace buried her face in his chest, sobbing with relief. The storm outside howled, but within the penthouse, something opened, a space where grief and hope could coexist. They stood there for a long time, two people stitched together by loss and fierce new love. Upstairs, Sophie stirred, as if sensing that her world had shifted forever. Jonathan drew back just enough to meet Grace's gaze. His voice was fierce, steady again. "Tomorrow, we take this to the jury. No more silence, no more shadows. I'll tell them everything. Amelia, Claire, the accident, the files. Let Farmadine try to hide from the truth. I won't stop until the world knows what they did." Grace nodded, her hand still clutching his sleeve the way Sophie always did. "We'll do it together." The storm battered Manhattan through the night, snow coating the city in a white shroud. But inside, amid grief and confession, a fragile family was born. Jonathan Hayes was no longer a man crushed by loss. He was a father again, armed with truth and love, ready to wage his final war against the shadows. 1 year later, Brooklyn Heights. The winter sun slanted through tall windows, spilling golden light across hardwood floors. Outside, the East River shimmered under pale skies, ferries cutting steady paths through the water. And in a brownstone filled with laughter, a family finally breathed freely. Jonathan Hayes stood at the base of a towering Christmas tree, a box of ornaments at his feet. His sleeves were rolled up, tie loosened, a far cry from the immaculate CEO who once walked Park Avenue like a ghost. Grace knelt nearby, carefully unwrapping delicate glass baubles. Sophie, now 3 years old and brimming with energy, scampered barefoot across the rug, her giggles echoing through the warm, fire-lit room. "Higher, Daddy," Sophie squealed as Jonathan lifted her into his arms so she could place a silver star on the tree. Jonathan's throat tightened every time she called him that. He steadied her with gentle hands, guiding the star onto the topmost branch. When she clapped her tiny hands in triumph, his chest swelled with a fullness he once believed he would never feel again. Grace watched them, her lips curved in a soft smile. Her eyes, once shadowed by fear, now carried light. She wore no makeup, no armor, just peace. The woman who had once clutched Sophie on a frozen bench outside Times Square now carried herself with quiet strength. The world had changed since that brutal winter. The trial had ended in victory. Farmadine executives convicted, Charles Whitmore disgraced, and Jonathan hailed not just as a CEO, but as a whistleblower who had risked everything for truth. Grace's testimony had been the cornerstone, her courage inspiring millions. With settlement funds and Jonathan's personal fortune, they had founded the Claire Hayes Community Health Center in the Bronx, a place where children received free medical care, where no parent had to choose between truth and survival. Grace now directed the center, her vision carried out with relentless compassion. She walked its halls daily, surrounded by children whose laughter felt like Sophie's echoed many times over. Jonathan, once haunted by the ghosts of Amelia and Claire, had found a way to honor them. Every plaque, every mural in the health center bore their names. It was not erasure of his past, but transformation. Out of tragedy, something enduring had been built. Yet tonight, as he lowered Sophie gently back onto the rug, Jonathan realized the greatest legacy wasn't the center or the trial. It was this moment. Home. Family. The fragile but fierce bond that had stitched his broken heart back together. Sophie tugged at Grace's sleeve. "Mommy, tell Daddy about the angel." Grace laughed softly. "She's been asking all week." She reached into a velvet-lined box and lifted out a small ornament. A porcelain angel with outstretched wings, painted in pale blue. Its edges were worn, the paint chipped in places, but it radiated a gentle beauty. Jonathan's breath caught. He knew it instantly. Amelia had bought it years ago, when Claire was just a baby. "Our angel will always watch over us," she had said, hanging it on their tree. His hand trembled as Grace pressed the ornament into it. "I found it when we moved," Grace whispered. "I thought maybe it belonged here again." For a moment, Jonathan couldn't speak. He turned the angel slowly in his hands. Memories flooding him, Claire's laughter, Amelia's voice, the ache of loss. But when he looked up, he saw Sophie's wide eyes and Grace's steady gaze. Yes, Amelia and Claire were gone, but their love had guided him here, to this room, to this family. He knelt beside Sophie, holding the ornament at her height. "Want to help me hang it?" Sophie nodded eagerly. Together, they placed the angel at the center of the tree. When the lights reflected off its wings, the room seemed to glow brighter, as though the past and present had finally reconciled. Later, as the fire crackled and the tree shone with warm light, Grace curled against Jonathan on the sofa while Sophie played with wooden blocks on the rug. Snow began to fall outside, dusting the brownstone's windows with white. Grace's voice was soft, filled with wonder. "Do you ever think about that night? About what would have happened if you hadn't stopped the car?" Jonathan's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Every day," he admitted. He kissed her temple. "But I did stop, and it saved me as much as it saved you." Grace tilted her head up to meet his eyes. "You saved us, Jonathan." He shook his head gently. "No, Grace. You and Sophie saved me." She smiled, tears glistening. He leaned down and kissed her softly, the kind of kiss that carried both gratitude and promise. Sophie looked up just in time to giggle. "Ew, Mommy and Daddy are kissing!" She buried her face in her hands, laughing. Jonathan laughed too, a deep, unguarded sound that filled the room with warmth. It was a sound Grace had once thought she would never hear from him. The night stretched long and gentle, filled with small joys. Sophie demanding another story, Grace humming a lullaby, Jonathan carrying his daughter upstairs and tucking her into bed. He stood at her doorway for a long time, watching her chest rise and fall in peaceful rhythm. "Good night, Sophie," he whispered. "You're home now. You'll always be home." Downstairs, Grace waited by the fire. When Jonathan joined her, he paused to look around. The tree, the stockings, the photos on the mantel. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel haunted. It felt alive. He sat beside her, their fingers intertwining. Outside, the snow fell in steady silence, covering the city in a white blanket. Inside, the warmth of the fire and the glow of the tree wrapped around them like a promise. Jonathan exhaled slowly, the weight of years finally lifting. "We're home," he said softly. Grace leaned her head on his shoulder. "Yes, home at last." And as the fire burned low, the storm that had once defined Jonathan Hayes gave way to peace. Out of loss, love had risen. Out of shadows, light had returned. And in the quiet of a Brooklyn Heights brownstone, a family, scarred but unbroken, found their forever. Thank you, dear friends, for staying with us until the very last page of Jonathan, Grace, and little Sophie's journey, from loss and betrayal to hope, family, and healing. If stories like this touch your heart, we warmly invite you to subscribe, so you'll never miss the next tale of love and second chances.